Hey everybody, it's Nick with Comics Beer and Sci-Fi. I'm at the Great Lakes Comic Con, and I'm with legendary comic book artist Keith Pollard, who I grew up loving so much of his artwork. Keith, thanks for talking to us today. How are you?
Well, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Now, you've come to a lot of these Great Lakes shows. How do you like them?
I've been with them since the beginning. They've evolved into this massive show now. I love doing this.
Yeah, I remember when it was a much, much smaller show as well. I've been coming, because we've been coming since the beginning as well. So let's get some history from you. How did you get involved in comic book art?
Well, I've always wanted to draw comics. I started out drawing when I was 6 years old. My father taught me. And when I discovered comic books, Superman and the others, Batman and Flash and the rest, I just gravitated to them, the flashiness of the storytelling and so forth. So I practiced that. And as I went through school, I, like many students out there, wasn't the best student in the world.
Was he drawing pictures on the margins like I was?
Exactly. And I decided at that time that I wanted to be a comic book artist. As I grew up, went to college, so forth, I began doing samples of comic art. I began researching the artists who drew comics. I started to become a fan of Marvel comics because they were a bit different.
Let me just back you up just a few seconds. Now, you said when you got into the DC characters initially, I assume this was in the 50s before Stan Lee started doing all the... So, okay, now let's go. So those characters initially inspired you. Were there any specific artists at that time, or were you kind of too much of a kid to really appreciate, Carmen Infantino or some of the...
As I said, as I started investigating comics, researching them, I found that I loved the artwork of Gil Kane and Kurt Swan over at DC. But around that time also, Marvel was just forming. They had just come out with their first couple of books. I wasn't too interested in, Tales to Astonish and all that. But eventually they came out with their first superhero, Spider-Man, as I recall, Amazing Fantasy 15. And
do you remember getting that?
Oh, yeah. I was in high school myself at the time, and I related to the character.
Sure.
He was a crazy character, a loner, didn't fit in. Yeah. Everything I thought I was.
All of us, yeah. That's why he was so popular.
Right. And I began doing samples later on. I discovered that they had what is called a Comic Con. At the time, it was called the Detroit Triple Fanfare. And I went down to that. I met this band down here named Marvell Jones. We formed a partnership and decided we were going to take our samples and we're going to show them to DC and Marvel and see where it goes. We got hired. That's how it...
How did you perfect your individual art style? Were there certain art, you mentioned a couple of artists, did you initially sort of try to copy their style, or did you just take some influence from them and then come up with your own style?
Well, all artists draw the examples of other artists' work. First I imitated, then I began to draw it on my own. But I would always... in the beginning I had comic books in front of me and I tried to draw exactly like the artists I liked, like Gil Kane or Kurt Swan. Then, when I felt confident, I knew what I was doing. That's when I put their comic books away and started drawing my own.
When you were learning to draw, did you draw in the so-called Marvel style where you'd start with a stick figure and then flesh it out? Did you eventually have to change to that style?
No, you developed a type of style that they like. It is a Marvel style, but you do it your way. Just like Jack Kirby does not look anything like Gil Kane's work. Mine did not look like anybody else's work, but it had that style. The house style at Marvel when I started was Jack Kirby's. He was a major influence. He was doing pretty much all their major books at the time. So it would behoove you to try and look as much like Kirby as you can. But there were other artists there, George Tuska, Gene Colan, all of them, nothing like Jack Kirby.
Right, that's true. So were there any basic rules that you had to follow? You do your own style, but were there any ground rules as a Marvel artist you had to stay like?
That's what separated Marvel at that time from DC. DC told a quieter story.
Right.
But Marvel was flashy. They did the foreshortening, with a fist in the face kind of thing, and really draw the fist big and the body really small,
I think in the How to Draw Comics, the Marvel Way book, it says the name of the game is Action, is the name of one of the chapters. And sir, what year did you start at Marvel?
I think it was 74.
Okay, and eventually you were doing Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four simultaneously, and Thor. And which writers were you working on?
Oh, which writers was I?
Amazing Spider-Man, you were probably 160, 170, 180, 190, around those issues, if I'm correct. And you did a lot of covers, too.
It started with Spider-Man 186. Spider-Man 186 was Spider-Man leaping out at you with after figures in the background.
And then how long did you stay with Marvel, and what did you do afterwards?
Oh, I stayed with Marvel well into the late 80s, with a brief stint at DC somewhere in that period. By the 90s, I was basically doing independent work with various comic companies. I can't even remember hearing them about. I'd say 1999, I just kind of switched careers. I always wanted to learn how computers work. And I ran across an ad. Oh, no, I didn't run across an ad. My friend Arvell, who was also into computers, he pointed out that a company called Tech Team at the time was looking for technicians, and they were desperate to get them. They were willing to hire anybody to work their help desk, telephone help desk, and they would train. And the salary was started off, I think it was $12 an hour. And I said, why not? I'll give it a shot. And I worked for them for 10 years, becoming fairly proficient with computers.
Can you tell us, was there any noticeable difference working at DC as opposed to Marvel? I know you said you weren't there very long, but I was just curious there was an atmosphere difference.
In the beginning, when I first showed my work at DC, it was unusual for me, because when I went over to their offices, I noticed that everybody wore suits and ties. They were very restrictive. They had a set way of doing things, and they felt they ruled the comic world at that time. When I went over to Marvel, it was more relaxed. People dressed for me, sweatshirts and blue jeans, and they kicked back. We had a bullpen where people not only did their comic artwork in, they ate there, they slept there. Yeah, it was very much a family type situation at Marvel, where it was very structured over at DC. When I ended up working at DC some 10 years later, DC had pretty much molded themselves into another version of Marvel. Everybody was very casual, very laid back, and a lot of the Marvel artists, writers had already been moved over there, so it wasn't much difference.
That makes sense. Lastly, I just wanted to ask, were there which personalities at either company are most significant to you? Like who did you cross paths with that had an impact? I mean, anybody from Roy Thomas to...
Pretty much everybody. You can start with Stan Lee. Stan was a salesman, entrepreneur, con man. He was everything. We tried to one degree or another, model ourselves after him. his philosophy of doing comics, pretty much affected everybody. Just about everybody up there, from Tony Isabella to Saul Harrison. I mean, they all played an important part.
George Byrne came along at that time, and John Byrne and George Perez were big artists at the time. Ross Andrew, all classic people. Did you have a favorite character you liked to work on, and a least favorite character you liked to work on?
Least favorite? Never had that question before. Spider-Man, as I mentioned, was the one that I wanted to work on the most. From there, it was Fantastic Four and Thor. They were all favorites of mine. Iron Man was another. Least favorite? Like, I don't know if I had a least favorite character.
So, I mean, if you drew a team book, you might get tired of drawing a whole team after a while. But, I mean, you got to draw a panel, so whether it's people or buildings or whatever, you still got to do the work.
Well, being an artist, I found whatever character I was working on, I'm trying to make him look the best he can do, and be as dynamic as possible, and impress the audience, So they all become your favorite characters.
I'm sorry, one last question. When I read about, like, Doctor Strange or Spider-Man, it seemed like Ditko did a lot of the plotting, or Kirby claimed to have done a lot of the plotting with his art, and said Stan is taking a little bit too much credit. Now, I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking about when you were working on the books, were you more of the storyteller, or did you follow the script more and just create the imagery?
A team.
Okay.
Certain writers tried to be a little more restrictive. I used to work with a writer named Doug Lynch.
Yeah.
Who he would type a 36-page plot for a 20-page comic book. It's almost impossible for an artist to fit all that he wanted into one book. So we had to call him up. We'd have give and take over the phone, and we would work out what would best be suited.
I see.
With the limitations I have and the limitations he had, we put them together and made it work.
Oh.
That's the way it is at Marvel. It was always what would you call it? A conference with the plot. The artist and the writer working together, trying to come up with an idea.
It's been a pleasure, sir, talking to you, and I will be right back to purchase. I have this issue. I love it, and plus it's Motown. I'll be right back.